And what, precisely, are those supposed to be? The voice, sharp and dripping with condescension, sliced through the quiet hum of the courtroom. Judge Marcus Holloway, a man whose youth was betrayed only by the lack of lines around his eyes and the crisp, unearned confidence in his posture, leaned forward over his imposing mahogany bench. His gaze was fixed not on the face of the old man standing before him, but on the small, tarnished row of medals pinned to the lapel of a threadbare tweed jacket. Are those decorations? The defendant, Samuel Thorne, blinked slowly. His hands, gnarled with age and speckled with liver spots, rested calmly on the wooden rail of the defendant's stand. He was in court for a disputed parking ticket, a bureaucratic nuisance that had somehow escalated to this formal hearing. He had worn his only suit, and the medals were as much a part of it as the buttons. "They were awarded to me, Your Honor," he replied, his voice a low, gravelly murmur, the sound of stones rolling in a slow tide. It was a statement of fact, offered without pride or defense. Judge Holloway smirked, a cruel, knowing expression that he often used to intimidate junior prosecutors. "Awarded to you? Really? For what?" "Perfect attendance at the bingo hall." A few sycophantic chuckles rippled through the front rows. The judge leaned back, steepling his fingers. "Sir, this is a court of law, not a costume party. I find it deeply offensive when people masquerade as heroes. It's a sickness in our society. People wanting recognition they never earned." He gestured dismissively at the old man's chest. "Let's see. What do we have here?" He squinted, feigning a connoisseur's interest. "This one," he said, pointing with his pen. "The ribbon is faded. Looks like something you'd get for a school bake sale. And this one here, with the star? Oh my, is that supposed to be a Navy Cross?" The judge let out a short, derisive laugh. "Sir, do you have any idea how rare a Navy Cross is? It is second only to the Medal of Honor. It is awarded for extraordinary heroism in combat. And you're telling me you earned one, and now you're here fighting a $30 parking fine." Samuel Thorne's expression didn't change. His gaze remained steady, fixed on a point just over the judge's shoulder, as if he were looking at a distant horizon. "Yes, Your Honor," he said, his voice unchanging. The quiet dignity of the response seemed only to fuel the judge's irritation. He saw it not as strength, but as senile stubbornness. "I don't believe you," Holloway snapped, his voice ringing with a final, unappealable verdict. "I believe you are engaging in a disgusting act of stolen valor, right here in my courtroom. You buy these trinkets at a pawn shop or online, pin them to your shabby little jacket, and expect to what? Thank you for your service?" He slammed his palm servicios on the bench, not with the official crash of a gavel, but with the flat, angry slap of personal insult. "Bailiff, I want you to examine these things. I'm half tempted to have them confiscated as fraudulent articles." The bailiff, a burly man in his 50s with a kind face, hesitated. He looked from the judge's furious expression to the old man's placid one, and a deep unease settled in his gut. He took a reluctant step forward. "Your Honor, maybe we could just proceed with the matter at hand." "The matter at hand," Judge Holloway interrupted, his voice rising, "is a fundamental lack of respect for this court and for the very fabric of this nation. It is about the honor of the men and women who actually earned these medals with their blood and sacrifice. It is not about your parking ticket anymore, sir. It is about your character." He pointed a trembling finger at Thorne. "And I find your character to be fraudulent." The air in the courtroom grew thick and heavy. The murmuring had stopped, replaced by a tense, uncomfortable silence. Everyone watched the old man, waiting for him to break, to cry, to confess his supposed lie. Samuel Thorne simply lowered his eyes to his own medals, his gaze lingering on them for a moment, not with vanity, but with a flicker of memory, a ghost of a life lived far from this sterile, air-conditioned room. He said nothing. His silence was a wall the judge's vitriol could not breach. Just as Holloway opened his mouth to pronounce a sentence for contempt, the grand, double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a heavy, decisive thud. The sound was so authoritative that every head, including the judge's, snapped toward the entrance. A figure stood silhouetted against the bright light of the hallway. He was tall, ramrod straight, and clad in the immaculate, starched white service dress of a United States Navy officer. The sunlight glinted off the rows of ribbons on his chest, and, More startlingly, off the 5 stars gleaming on each of his shoulder boards. A Fleet Admiral. In this municipal traffic court, the bailiff, a Navy veteran himself, audibly gasped and snapped to attention, his training kicking in instinctively. The uniformed man strode into the courtroom, his polished black shoes making no sound on the tiled floor. He moved with a purpose that seemed to warp the very air around him. The room, which had been Judge Holloway's absolute domain, suddenly felt like borrowed space. The Admiral did not look at the judge. He did not look at the stunned faces in the gallery. His eyes, the color of a stormy sea, were locked on one man and one man only, the elderly defendant in the worn tweed jacket. He walked directly to the defendant's table, stopping less than a foot from Samuel Thorne. The entire courtroom held its breath. Then, in a move that sent a shockwave through the room, the 5-star Admiral, a man who commanded fleets and answered only to the president, brought his heels together with a sharp click. He raised his hand to his brow in a salute so crisp, so precise, it could have been carved from marble. The gesture was filled with a reverence that bordered on awe. Master Chief Thorne. The Admiral's voice was a low, powerful baritone, a command voice accustomed to being heard over the roar of jet engines and crashing waves. "It is an honor to see you again, sir." Samuel Thorne finally looked up, his calm gaze meeting the Admiral's. A flicker of recognition, of shared history, passed between them. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. "Admiral Vance," he acknowledged, his voice still quiet, but now holding a note of warmth. Judge Holloway's face had gone from flushed red to a pasty, sickly white. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The gavel felt like a lead weight in his hand. The symbol of his authority was now a child's toy. He was a king in a cardboard crown, and the true sovereign had just walked into his castle. "Admiral Vance," Holloway finally managed, his voice a reedy squeak. What is the meaning of this?" Admiral Jonathan Vance slowly lowered his salute, but he did not turn to face the judge. He kept his attention on Thorne, placing a gentle hand on the old man's shoulder. "I'm here to pay a debt, Your Honor, and to stand as a character witness for one of the finest men the United States Navy has ever produced." Only then did the Admiral turn his head, and the full, formidable force of his gaze fell upon Judge Holloway. The judge physically recoiled, as if struck. The Admiral's eyes were not angry. They were something far worse. They were disappointed, and heavy with a cold, righteous fury. "I was in my vehicle downstairs, on my way to a briefing at the Pentagon, when I received a text from one of your court clerks, a young man who happens to be a Navy reservist," Vance stated, his tone level and dangerously calm. "He informed me that a decorated veteran was being accused of stolen valor in your courtroom. He sent me a photo. I came immediately." He gestured toward Thorne's lapel. "You called his medals trinkets, I believe. You questioned their authenticity. You, a man who has likely never experienced a moment of genuine fear or sacrifice in his entire life, sat in judgment of a man who has lived a lifetime of both." The Admiral took a step toward the bench, and the judge seemed to shrink. "Let us educate you, Your Honor. Let's start with the one you so cleverly compared to a bake sale prize. That is the Navy and Marine Corps Medal. It is the highest non-combat decoration for heroism awarded by the Department of the Navy. It is awarded for acts of life-saving, at great personal risk." Vance's voice dropped, becoming the voice of a storyteller, and the courtroom became his stage. "On the night of February 12, 1988, at Naval Station Norfolk, a faulty space heater started a fire in Barracks 7. I was a 20-year-old ensign, barely a year out of the academy, sleeping on the 3rd floor. The alarm didn't sound. The smoke was what woke us. It was thick, black, and poisonous. We couldn't see. We couldn't breathe. It was chaos." He paused, his eyes finding Thorne's again. Then, through the smoke, a figure appeared. He wasn't a firefighter. He had no mask, no gear. He was a petty officer first class, off duty, who had seen the smoke from his own quarters a block away. It was Samuel Thorne. The Admiral's voice resonated with the memory, painting a vivid, terrifying picture for the silent courtroom. He charged into that building when everyone else was charging out. He found a sailor who had been overcome by smoke on the 1st floor and carried him out. Orders were screamed at him to stay out, that the fire department was on its way. He ignored them. He went back in. The Admiral's gaze swept the room. He went back in a second time, finding two more disoriented sailors on the second floor and guiding them, choking and stumbling, to a stairwell. By this time, small explosions were going off. The heat was immense. His hair was singed, his face was black with soot. A chief warrant officer physically tried to restrain him, telling him it was a suicide mission. Thorne just said, "There are more men in there, Chief," and ran back into the inferno for a third time. The judge sat frozen, his face a mask of dawning horror. The story was not just a recitation of facts. It was a living testimony, delivered by a man who had been there. He made it to the third floor, where I and 6 other men were trapped, Vance continued, his voice thick with emotion. A section of the hallway had collapsed, cutting off our escape. The smoke was so thick we were all on the floor, gasping for our last breaths. We had accepted we were going to die. Then he was there, a ghost in the smoke, calling to us. He led us, crawling, to a small supply room at the end of the hall. The fire was roaring behind us. He smashed the window with his bare elbow, slicing his arm to the bone. Vance unconsciously touched his own forearm, as if feeling a phantom pain. The window was small, overlooking a second-story roof. Too small to climb through easily. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed the first sailor, a terrified kid from Ohio, and physically shoved him through the opening. Then the second, the third. He was a machine, fueled by a purpose I cannot begin to describe. He saved each one of us, pushing us to safety while he remained in hell. The Admiral's voice cracked for the first time. I was the 7th man he pushed out that window. As I tumbled onto the roof below, I looked back. I saw him turn to help the others. There were 3 more. Just as he shoved the 10th and final man through the opening, a massive support beam, burnt through and groaning, crashed down from the ceiling. It landed directly on his leg, pinning him to the floor. We could only watch, helpless, as the flames engulfed the room he was in. The silence in the courtroom was absolute, broken only by a single, choked sob from a woman in the gallery. Judge Holloway looked as if he was about to be sick. Firefighters with breathing apparatuses pulled him from the wreckage 20 minutes later, Vance said, his voice regaining its steel. They said he was conscious the whole time, trying to brace the beam to keep it from crushing him completely. His leg was shattered in 3 places. He had third-degree burns over 20% of his body. His lungs were permanently scarred. He spent 6 months at Portsmouth Naval Hospital. The 10 men he saved? They all survived. Every single one. Including me. He let that fact hang in the air, a devastating payload. That, Your Honor, is what you get for a bake sale. That is why he was awarded the Navy and Marine Corps Medal. The Admiral then pointed to the other medal, the one Holloway had mocked with such derision. As for the Navy Cross you found so highly unlikely, he earned that 2 years later, during Operation Praying Mantis. He was a chief petty officer by then, serving on the USS Wainwright. His actions in the engagement with the Iranian frigate Sahand are, to this day, largely classified. But I will tell you this. You do not have the security clearance to hear the details, and I do not have the authorization to share them. But I assure you, and I stake my entire career and honor on this, that no man was more deserving of that medal. He is a hero, twice over and 100 times more in ways that never earned a medal. The Admiral stepped back, his duty done. He stood beside Samuel Thorne, a silent, unshakable guardian. The power dynamic in the room had not just been reversed, it had been annihilated. There was no judge, no defendant. There was only a legend, and the world that had forgotten him. Judge Marcus Holloway stared, his mind struggling to process the chasm that had just opened up beneath his feet. He had built his world on a foundation of perceived status, of rules, and of his own infallible judgment. In the span of 10 minutes, that entire foundation had been reduced to dust. The man he had scorned, the frail old man in the shabby jacket, was a giant. And he, the judge, was a pitifully small man, cloaked in a black robe that suddenly felt like a costume. Slowly, mechanically, he rose to his feet. The movement was stiff, pained. He looked at Samuel Thorne, truly seeing him for the first time. He saw the faint web of scars on his neck, the slight limp he hadn't noticed before, the profound, unshakable peace in his eyes, the peace of a man who had walked through fire and faced down death, and had nothing left to fear, least of all the uninformed opinions of an arrogant judge. Case dismissed, Holloway whispered, the words catching in his throat. But that wasn't enough. It couldn't be. An apology in this formal setting would be an insult. He needed to do more. In a move that shocked every person in the room, Judge Holloway stepped down from the bench. He walked across the courtroom floor, his own footsteps now seeming loud and clumsy, and stopped before the defendant's stand. He was no longer a judge. He was just a man, stripped bare of his title and his pride. He stood before Master Chief Samuel Thorne, his head bowed. "Master Chief Thorne," he began, his voice trembling and broken. "Sir, there are no words. The dishonor was mine. The ignorance was mine. I am so profoundly sorry." Tears welled in his eyes, tears of pure, undiluted shame. Samuel Thorne looked at the young, broken man before him. He saw not the arrogant judge, but a man who had just learned a life-altering lesson. There was no malice in the old veteran's eyes, no hint of triumph. There was only a deep, abiding grace. He offered a small, forgiving nod. A slight smile touched his lips, and it was like the sun breaking through a century of clouds. "We all make mistakes, son," Thorne said softly. "The important thing is what we do after." With that, Admiral Vance gently placed his hand on the old hero's back. "Let's go home, Master Chief." Together, the five-star admiral and the unassuming Master Chief Petty Officer turned and walked toward the courtroom doors. They walked side by side, two pillars of a brotherhood forged in fire and service. The entire courtroom, from the gallery to the prosecutor's table, rose to its feet in a spontaneous, silent tribute. As they departed, Judge Marcus Holloway remained standing in the middle of the floor, alone. He slowly turned and looked back at his high, empty bench, at the gavel lying uselessly on its surface. He finally understood. True authority wasn't in the robe or the title. It was earned. It was earned in smoke-filled hallways, on pitching decks in hostile waters, and in the quiet, unassuming dignity of a life lived for others. It was an honor he had a long way to go to even begin to comprehend, let alone possess.